you have a fever. Not the mild fever of a winter flu that disappears with ibuprofen and rest. I'm talking about a fever that makes a straw mattress feel like burning coals. A fever that warps your thoughts, that turns the stone ceiling above you into a pulsing, threatening surface. Your body smells of sour sweat. Your lips are cracked. Every breath is a conscious effort. You've been brought to the only man who can save your life, the most respected physician in your city. He has no stethoscope. There are no blood tests. There is no machine whatsoever that can decode what is destroying you from the inside. The office is a claustrophobic room lit by candlelight, and the smell of dried herbs attempts and fails to mask the heavy organic odor that dominates the space. The doctor asks you to urinate into a glass flask. You hand it over, embarrassed, feeling the warmth of the still hot liquid through the glass in your hands. He holds the flask up against the candle flame. He observes, rotates it slowly, evaluates the color, the turbidity, the foam that forms as it's swirled. Then, in a sequence of gestures you cannot believe you're witnessing, he brings the flask to his nose. Inhales, closes his eyes with the concentration of a sommelier before a rare wine. And then, without hesitation, without any sign of disgust, he dips his index finger into the warm liquid and brings it to his mouth, closes his eyes again, tastes. Welcome to the 14th century. Welcome to medieval uroscopy, the era when your doctor's tongue was the most advanced laboratory on the planet. And today, we're going to enter this visceral, technical, and profoundly human world that separated the living from the dead for a millennium of medical history. To understand why a trained man would taste urine as standard professional practice, you need to understand the absolute vacuum of knowledge in which medieval medicine operated. There were no microscopes. The first functional version wouldn't appear until the late 16th century. That means bacteria, viruses, fungi, the true horror zoo inhabiting our bodies, were completely invisible, inconceivable, non-existent to the science of the time. There was no analytical chemistry. The synthetic reagents that today identify glucose, protein, and pH in your urine within seconds were absolute impossibilities in a world where the most advanced science was plant distillation and speculative alchemy. What existed was the human body and its products. The dominant theory was that of the four humors, an elaborate and internally coherent system that viewed the body as a battlefield between four fundamental substances: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was balance, disease was imbalance, and urine, described in texts of the era as the filtrate of the blood, a direct distillation of the organism's internal state, was the clearest window available into that battlefield. The medieval physician was not being primitive by tasting urine. Within his scientific paradigm, he was being rigorous, meticulous, professional. The central tool of this system was the rota urinaria, the urine wheel. Imagine a circular chart printed on parchment, divided into 20 distinct segments. Each segment corresponded to a specific color of urine, and each color mapped to a diagnosis and a prognosis. It was a sophisticated technical document, studied for years at medical training centers such as Salerno and Bologna. Milky white indicated excess phlegm, the cold, moist humor. Pale yellow pointed to moderate dehydration. Intense orange signaled active fever and inflammation. Bright red, internal violence, bleeding, an acute crisis. And black, black as writing ink, was a near incontestable death sentence. When urine reached that point, the physician knew that putrefaction had already conquered the body from within. There was little to do but call for the priest. But color was only the first act of the diagnosis. The second act was smell. An experienced physician could detect ketoacidosis, the sweetish, mildly rotten odor we now associate with diabetic complications. through trained olfaction alone. He could identify severe urinary tract infections by their excessive ammoniacal stench. Smell was data, raw data, but data. The third act was taste, and this is where the story becomes simultaneously brutal and fascinating. A bitter, acidic flavor indicated hepatic collapse, the overtaxed liver altering the chemical composition of what the kidneys expelled. A salty taste pointed to severe dehydration, the body consuming its own reserves. A vinegar-like sourness suggested internal fermentation, decomposition processes we would today associate with certain systemic infections. But there was one flavor that ran ice through the blood of any medieval patient who knew what it meant: sweetness. Centuries before Frederick Banting isolated insulin in 1921. Centuries before we understood the pancreas, glucose receptors, the metabolic cascade of diabetes, medieval physicians would taste the urine and recognize that honeyed sweetness, explicitly comparing it to honey. Hence the name that has survived to this day. Diabetes Mellitus. Mellitus, from Latin, honey. When the doctor tasted that sweetness and closed his eyes, he wasn't tasting sugar. He was tasting glucose the body could no longer metabolize, being expelled in anomalous concentrations. Without knowing any of this, he knew that body was, in the words of the texts of the time, melting away and pouring out through the urine. The diagnosis was precise. The mechanism was misunderstood. The observation was brilliant. The medieval consulting room was a sensory theater of an intensity no modern hospital can replicate. Patients arrived carrying still warm flasks wrapped in cloth. The physician received them in a ritualistic sequence that blended science, theology, and intuition. Before any analysis, many practitioners would pray, because illness was simultaneously a physical problem and a divine signal. Humoral imbalance and sin were not seen as separate categories. Superstition ran deep through the diagnostic process. Urine collected on an auspicious day of the lunar calendar was considered more revealing. Some medieval texts instructed physicians not to receive the flask with hands soiled by another substance, so as not to contaminate the reading. There was a science to handling the flask, gripping it by the body, not the base, so as not to alter the temperature before analysis. And the physician who refused to taste? That physician lost credibility, lost patience. In the hierarchy of diagnosis, taste was the test of courage and professional commitment. Tasting urine was not an unpleasant side detail of the job. It was proof that you took your craft seriously. It's tempting to laugh. It's tempting to feel nauseated and dismiss these men as primitives dancing in the darkness of ignorance. But consider what they accomplished within the absolute limitations of their time. They had no machines, so they transformed their own senses into instruments of precision. Over centuries, they developed a sensory vocabulary for what the body expels. A vocabulary that identified diabetes by its flavor, hepatic failure by its odor, critical dehydration by its color, centuries before any instrument existed that could confirm those intuitions. These were the first biohackers in history, the first biomarker analysts, the first to codify, in charts and parchment wheels, the chemical language the body uses to signal its own destruction. Modern medicine was born from the strong stomachs of these people, from hands that did not tremble when plunging into a flask and raising to the mouth what most of us cannot even bring ourselves to imagine. Every scientific advance, the microscope, analytical chemistry, modern reagents, was built upon the foundation of observations like these. Observations made by human beings who had no more tools than their own senses, but who used those senses with absolute discipline and courage. Today, our urine passes through machines that in seconds detect what would have taken a medieval physician hours to conclude. And yet the central logic remains intact. The body speaks through what it expels. That principle, distilled on the tongue of a 14th century doctor, is still the cornerstone of every medical laboratory on the planet. If this video made you see history from a different angle, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell. Because the next video is going to require an even stronger stomach than this one.